In the last tutorial, I have explained what is response entity in Spring Boot and how we can leverage it to return our customized HTTP response. Now in this tutorial, I'm going to explain how we can handle any kind of exception occurred in our application. Let's get started. Here we have an example controller which is returning a list of student, and we are returning a generic response which is response detail. In the response detail we have few variables, few class variables. First one is the boolean, which is for success or failure. Second one is the message if our response have any message, and the third one, which is data, is the most important class variable in this class and is of type object. That means it can have any type of data like a list or a detail or anything. And if we have a series of errors, we can use this class. And finally, I kept another variable called debug hint, which sometimes help developer to debug things, right? So I have created getter setter and a few constructor of this class for convenience. One constructor is taking all argument, another constructor is only taking the data. And by default I have set the status to success, so unless we are explicitly updating this variable, the status of the request will be returned true. If I run this controller and check out what is this is returning, we'll have a better understanding. I've run our project and clicking on refresh, and we are getting success true, no message, and we're getting the data as a list of student and null value for other variables. Okay, this is fine. This is when everything is working fine, but sometimes things get out of our hand and random exceptions occur, right? That is why production bug exists. Okay, so let's imagine an example that something went wrong and an exception occurs. So for simulating, I can declare a variable and it will be taking result of an integer divided by 0, right? So this is not legal, we know that, but we're not getting any error in our controller. And let's run our application and see what happens. Our application is running, we are refreshing the page, we're getting this white level error page, which is a default error page in Spring Boot. That means something really went wrong, which is not handled, and Spring is showing their default fallback page with status code of 500. That means internal server error. Okay, so what you can do to avoid this kind of unexpected errors, right? Things can go wrong and we have to be prepared for that. So in that case, we can handle this kind of scenario with Spring's exception handling. So we can declare method as exception handler with a specific type of exception, and that method will be taking control of that exception and return a response based on the method's return type. Let me explain with coding. Here I am creating a new package as advice, and I'll have a class as global exception handler. So how to identify this class as an exception handler class so that any exception occur in our application, some method from this class is to be executed. So for that, we have to declare this class as controller advice, right? The name is very appropriate because this is advice for controller. I have identified this class as controller advice. That means when an exception occurs, Spring will look for method of this class which is handling that kind of exception. So for now, first of all, let's handle the father of all exception, which is the exception class, so that any form of exception occur, our application is not going out of control. Our application is returning the response we want it to respond. So for that, we have to implement a method like this. Since we are taking control of the full HTTP response, we need to return a response entity, and the data of the HTTP response is response TTO. Okay, so this annotation is telling Spring that when any type of exception occurs, execute this method, given that the exact exception type is not found in this class. So if arithmetic exception is occurred and there is a method which is handling arithmetic exception, then that method will be executed because Spring has found the exact type of exception handled. So if nothing found, then Spring will check out the immediate parent, and if no parent is available, then it will go to the hierarchy of inheritance. So if no exception is found, then the father of all exception, this exception will handle the rest. So let's implement and complete this method. So since we are returning the response entity, we need to create a variable of response entity without data and return it. So let's declare a variable as response entity of type response TTO response. So since we'll have multiple exceptions, right, let's create a generic method which will take the necessary parameter and give us the desired response. Let's give the name of the method as build response. For simplicity, we can always refactor later. Let's understand the idea first, and this method will take few parameters. The first one is HTTP status code. That means in case of this exception occurs, we'll return internal server error. So HTTP status dot internal server error. Okay, for readability, let's give the parameters in new lines. So we are sending few information to build our desired response entity. The first one is internal server error. The second one is if we want to return any specific message. For that, we are typing something went wrong. We are working on it. Okay, this is the second thing we want to have in our response. Third one is exception. We are passing this information to build the response. So let's pass the exception in this method. So we have declared the param of this method. Let's implement this method with help of IntelliJ. So here, creating the method. For readability, let's implement them with new lines. So this method will return a response entity with data for any kind of exception occurred in our application. Since the response entity will have the body of response DTO, let's create a variable for this response DTO first and populate the data. And this response DTO have a constructor which take the success status, message, data, and other error and debug related thing. The first one is the success of operation, which should be false in this case. Second one is the message. So we are getting a message from this method parameter. I am passing this message. The third one is data. In this case, we are not returning any data because an exception just occurred. So this will be null. The fourth one is linked hash map, means if we have anything, an error message like form validation error or anything else. So in this case, this will also be null. And the last variable is debug hint. Since an exception occur, we can return the message from the exception. So in that case, exception dot get message. Be careful about returning the full exception because that will make the response body huge, and it will also expose some unnecessary internal implementation, which is not a good idea. I have created the response TTO. Now I have to put it in the response entity. So returning the response entity, return new response entity, and response entity have few constructor. So we need the constructor with two parameter, the response body and the HTTP status code. So first of all, we are returning the data in first parameter, which is data, and second one is the HTTP status code, which we are getting from the parameter, the status, and returning this. So our implementation is done. This method will return a response entity for our exception handler method for any kind of exception occurred in our application. Okay, so I'm returning the prepared response. So everything looks fine. Let's run and check if I have implemented correctly. Application started. Let's refresh our page here. We are getting a message instead of a default fallback error page of Spring. We are getting a JSON response where success is false, message showing something went wrong. We are looking at why we are getting this message, because I have deliberately put something in my controller which is dividing by 0, representing a runtime exception, an unexpected thing. Okay, so I think we have got the idea how we can handle exception in our application. So now let's say we are implementing a controller to get the information of a student, but that student doesn't exist. So we want to forcefully throw an exception saying that student not found, and we are throwing an exception manually. The name of the exception can be student not found exception. So in that case, how we can handle that exception? Okay, first of all, we have to create that exception, the potential exception that can occur, or that potential exception that we want to throw. Once again, I'm creating a new package called exceptions. And in this exception package, I'm creating a new class as student not found exception. This student not found exception class needs to extend the runtime exception. If this class has a class variable, let's say message, then I have also created a constructor for this class, and this comes handy sometimes, let's say when we want to internationalize our application. So here I have declared the constructor for here I have declared the custom exception I want to throw. So now in our controller, in case of a random runtime exception, now I'll throw a custom exception. So let's say throw student not found exception. I know that this doesn't make any sense inside this all controller, but this is just for your understanding. This exception will be thrown in the appropriate place, but I'm just explaining how you can handle those kind of scenario. So I'm throwing a new exception, and in the exception constructor I'm returning a new message, custom message. So it is showing that the code will not do anything. We are throwing a custom exceptions with this custom message, and I want these exceptions also to be handled in the exception handler. So first of all, let's see how the default behavior is. So I'm running the application once again and refreshing the application. So since we have handled the exception class, our declared student not found exception is a type of runtime exception, and runtime exception is a subclass of exception. This custom throwing of exception is being handled by the global exception handler. Let's say instead of this, let's say I want to create another method as like this, which will solely handle the student not found exception. And here in the constructor I'm throwing the student not found exception, and here in the status of the HTTP status code I'm returning. This is for an example. I'm just changing the different status, changing to different status code, which is more permanently means 301. Okay. Or something else. Let's say bad request 404 or unauthorized forbidden not found. I can return 404. So let's return not found, and I'm in the message part I'm saying student not found. With this data I am building the response, and the response will be prepared in this method and returned in our HTTP request. Let's rerun our application and see what happens. Application started. I'm refreshing the page and I'm getting the response as student not found. If I open the network tab and refresh the page, and I'll see that the status code is 404 not found. So even though we have global exception handled, but since we have the exact type of exception handled, which is being thrown from the controller, first of all, Spring is returning based on the handled method. So Spring will first check if the exact exception is handled. If not, then it will look at the inheritance. So I hope you got the idea how we can handle exception. And interesting thing is, all the example I have shown so far only for REST. Let's say you want to show a default web page when a specific controller doesn't exist. That can also be done, which is for a Spring MVC project. Since we are following the REST structure in this tutorial series, we are sticking into REST. So I hope you got the idea how we can handle exceptions. Happy coding. I'll see you in the next tutorial.